Growing plants is getting harder, more expensive, more complex, increasingly more difficult. I'm Chad Masura, CEO and founder of Rosie, and this is How We Grow. Okay, welcome to How We Grow. I'm super excited to be joined here with Dr. Brian Jackson, who is a horticultural scientist at NC State University, and his work focuses on soilless growing media and how substrate choices affect real production outcomes, especially as the industry thinks about and tries to reduce peat and evaluates alternatives. He has studied engineered wood fibers since his PhD work and is known for translating substrate science into practical decision-making for growers, i.e. how water behavior changes, what shifts in fertility and pH to expect, and how to trial new mixes without risking an entire crop. I've known Brian for a few years now, and really since the early days of Rosie Soil. I'm constantly blown away by his work and his experience in this industry, and I'm super excited to have him on today. So yeah, welcome, Brian.
Thank you so much, Chad. It's a pleasure to be invited on the show, and I'm excited to have a conversation.
Yeah, same here. So let's dive into it. I mean, I want to hear your sort of story and background in this career. You know, I think most people don't set out to say they want to study dirt. And so, you know, I think substrate and media is certainly sort of a background material, but how did you find yourself getting interested in this, and how have we ended up where we are today?
Yeah, your assumption about this being an area of tremendous interest, certainly from a kid or a college-age student, is spot on, because it's very rare. I think for me, and you know, I've thought about this as I continue to get older and over the course of my career, kind of what led me to in this direction and what got me to this current place. And it all began for me, you know, growing up on a tobacco farm in southeastern North Carolina. So from the 80s and 90s as a kid, all I knew was big agriculture my whole life. And being in the tobacco industry, which is very different today, even in North Carolina, than it was in the 80s and 90s, we grew our tobacco transplants in the soil. We would sow the seeds, then cover it with plastic and cheesecloth, and then by April we would have to pull these bare root transplants out of the soil, and then we'd have to sort them by size because the variability was incredible, and then transplant these bare root seedlings into the field. And then it was April of 1996 when the largest tobacco grower in my community had purchased and built the first greenhouse to grow his tobacco transplants. And in April of 1996, I walked into that greenhouse for the first time and saw tens of thousands of floating styrofoam trays with the most uniform, perfect tobacco transplants I had ever seen in my life. And that level of technology, to me, was probably equivalent to someone today stepping onto Mars for the first time, realizing, wow, we've actually done this. And that was my absolute first memory of this hydroponic growing plants out of a traditional soil system, and I became enamored with it. And then the follow-up piece to that, when I got to college for my undergraduate studying horticulture, and then with my graduate work both at Auburn University and Virginia Tech, the projects that were aligned and ready for me to work on were all substrate soilless culture based. So I dove in and got to really kind of test the waters on the research side of how do we grow plants in soilless, and I've never looked back.
Cool, super cool. Are they still growing those seedlings that way today, or have they evolved to an even new system? What does it look like?
Yeah, the system now for tobacco is as high tech as most any other greenhouse you would go into, as far as the uniformity and the production strategies for transplants for field. Yeah.
Cool. So tell me about some of your early research. What did it look like during your undergrad and grad time, and then how has that evolved now as you've continued in academia?
Yeah, as an undergraduate, really there was very little research that I actually chose to be involved in. But what did happen in my undergraduate degree closer to the end is I realized, as I was looking to the future about what I wanted to do, that while I loved horticulture, I wasn't as enthralled with the application of going out and doing it as much as I was with the science behind why and how. And that led me to go to graduate school, where I also developed one of my deepest, I think, more inherent passions of teaching and working with people. So those were the reasons that drove me to graduate school. And my project for my master's degree that was literally just handed to me without much of an option was working with cotton gin compost in the Southeast as a raw material to compost and then use in soilless mixes. So I did a 2-year project working with greenhouse tomatoes and some nursery ornamental crop with varying levels of cotton compost. And then I was recruited to go to Virginia Tech for my PhD on this idea that Dr. Robert Wright at Virginia Tech had about grinding up pine trees and using wood as a media, which in 2004 was very, very foreign concept. And I said, well, yeah, let's go. So spent 3.5 years working on engineered wood fiber, and then got to NC State in 2009. And what I have since learned as a professor, it seems as though my career path relative to what I work on is pretty unique compared to other faculty, because the exact topic of my PhD dissertation is the exact area of work that needed to continue to be worked on and where interest in development and evolution was going in the horticultural industry. So I haven't had to pivot at all, except just updating science and moving things forward in the last almost 18 years, which is pretty cool.
That's amazing. That's amazing.
I am a testament to the concept of being an inch wide but a mile deep, as far as my knowledge base being pretty focused on one little area.
Yeah, yeah. So tell me a little bit about that interplay between, I would say, how the industry is thinking about substrates, the pressures that they're feeling on trying to find alternatives, and how that has shaped, your research over the last 20 years or so.
Yeah, and that's a good broad overview of really addressing all of the questions that are currently being posed and the initiatives that are currently in place trying to answer some of these questions.
But I'm curious to hear from your perspective the history of it too. I want to talk about today and where you see the future is going, but I'm really curious what the kind of throughput is.
Sure.
Since you've watched this so closely for the last 20 years, how have the perspectives shifted, and what have been some of the pressures that have driven the industry to do so?
So let me start that answer by going back a little bit further, because when peat moss and peat materials began to be really utilized in growing systems and some type of formulated growing mix, this was back in the 1940s, a little bit prior to that, but really in the 1940s and 50s. But if you look through the literature and certainly look through grower magazines, and there's a number of them from early part of the 20th century, there were peat replacements that were being prompted and promoted and researched even dating back to the 1950s. And all through the 60s, it was peat replacement this, the new peat, all of this. But the reasons that the industry was looking for alternatives then are no different than the reasons now. And that primarily hinges upon the availability of peat year by year, which is completely dictated by weather patterns in the peat producing regions. When it rains during the summer, it inhibits and lowers their capacity to harvest peat. Therefore, they cannot extract the volumes that they want or that they have targeted, despite their best efforts. So it's availability from that. And then it's cost, which is obviously factored into not only availability and supply and demand, but those are the two things that have always driven options, alternatives. And fast forward to today, and I think today actually to me starts 2020. And the reason I indicate that as kind of a pivotal transition moment in the horticultural production industry, certainly as it relates to substrates, is that when the pandemic hit now 6 years ago this month or last month, all through 2020 and 2021, when horticulture became the greatest thing ever and people were staying at home and doing more gardening, then the shortage of supplies and the demand for plants and growing media reached an all-time high. What we also saw is a tremendous disruption of supply chains from foreign goods that we ship in from other parts of the world for plant production and for growing media, including to some extent peat, but also coconut coir and stone wools and a lot of other materials. So what that did, for the first time in a long time, it had exposed a lot of growers to the reality that the supply chain sensitivity or uncertainty was a weak spot for them as a business. And it exposed I think the interest in why can't we do more domestically? What can we do to be less reliant on foreign materials? Not that we're better, but just how to buffer that insecurity as far as supply chain from external sources. All right, so you've got that. Second thing that's happened now in the last, let's say 5-7 years, is you've got an increase in the overall demand of growing media nationally and globally due to the increased production of so many new crops in soilless systems, in addition to the growth of the traditional segments, vegetables, floriculture, nursery, etc. So there's that aspect. And what another piece of that puzzle that's different today that's driving this is geopolitics. And within geopolitics comes tariffs as one sensitive issue that also is on people's radar. It provides uncertainty to the business model for any grower who's trying to plan ahead. So, and then there's the sustainability side of trying to align company efforts to better sustainability goals, whether that's truly believed or whether it's marketing approach or whatever. So Chad, I think that's what's different now, 2020 to 2026, than holistically in the last 60 years. Those little pieces and troubles have always existed, but never so condensed all at one time. Yeah. And the last piece of that I would also say that has fueled a lot of this is there are platforms today for the general public to learn, whether it's true information or misrepresented information, but more people know more today, and they can form opinions about things, and then they voice their opinions as they want to change the product offerings that they're given or whatever other issue it is. So all of that is just kind of my viewpoint of what's kind of led us to where we're at today.
Fascinating. And I totally hear you on the supply side, on the economic side, on the supply chain resilience side, and of course, whatever the maybe cherry on top the sustainability story is for finding alternatives to peat, wherever people sit on the sort of peat conversation spectrum, if you will. But I'm curious where performance comes into this. Are you seeing growers, are they so used to peat and the way that peat performs despite some of its drawbacks in a container, that when you're thinking about alternatives to find, you're trying to basically comp it against peat in the exact same structure, with the exact same watering style and the exact same fertilization process? It's interesting to me that performance doesn't play stronger into that historical narrative that you crafted, or perhaps it does and you just are thinking about it differently.
I think in an ideal world, we all wish that there would be something that could just step in as a different product that could provide the same economics or better economics, the same yield, the same management, the same everything, so that we didn't have to change how we do things. Right. I think that's the first intuition people have is, I don't want to change anything, but I want something different. And rarely do those two things actually happen. The same thing, Chad, is very evident, again, going back in history, because history can teach us so much about our behaviors and how things happened in the past and how that might give us answers for the future. When growers went from putting soil in containers, which at the time were metal tin cans, and they started to transition into a peat sand mix or a peat perlite mix, the complaints ran rampant through the grower circles.
Because it was already changed. They were used to the way.
The cans fly over. It doesn't hold water. It doesn't do this. It doesn't do this. The same things occurred then because the transition was stark. It was different. But once that transition occurred and the positive benefits outweighed the negative benefits, and when the challenges were worked out through practice, trial, error, research and development, then everyone was happy. Everyone was completely happy. And I think now, when you look at any grower of any cropping system that's using any soilless mix, when there's a shift in the composition of that soilless mix, there is the initial tendency that it should behave like it used to, like the traditional one did. And then when it doesn't, for some reason, then it's usually more of a quick gut approach of, well, this doesn't work, it's bad. as opposed to thinking, all right, well, I need to rethink this differently and start building a program around managing this for it to be its own self and for it to use its own functions and positives and not me expect it to do something that it can't. And that's the biggest challenge I see when people move away from one thing, in this case peat, to something else, is that expectation of what should happen based on what you know you've done in the past.
Yeah, definitely. I'm curious how you approach that problem. So let's ground it in today, here in 2026. You're chatting with a scaled horticulture grower who's thinking about peat reduction or cocoa reduction or just trying to build more diversity into their substrate supply chain. Where do you recommend they start? I mean, how do you think about structuring initial trials, thinking about different types of media, how to measure the outcome of that, and how do you ultimately overcome some of those challenges you were just running through where we're so used to the way this works and we don't want to change, we don't want to do anything differently, or we're worried about the risk of breaking something too.
Yeah, no, that's good. I think the first place I would start in that line of questions, or in that progression of decision making tools, is to start with geography. Where are you located? Because if you are a grower in Minnesota, and indoor plants, outdoor plants, whatever, and you make the decision to start trialing cocoa coir, well, you're anywhere near a port. So you've automatically added, you've chosen
Sure.
a material that already has 1,000 miles of transportation on a road somewhere. So that may not be your better option to look at for another material for whatever reason you want to do that. So I would always start with the location, I think, with that. The other thing with any material is, what is the background of how it's been developed, and is there evidence that I can be comfortable in that there are volumes of this material available on an annual basis that I can rely on, that I don't have to find myself in the same situation of wondering year to year to year, is this going to be available when I need it and in what volumes I need it.
Yeah, and to your point, that's still that's a regional question. It varies greatly by where they're based.
It is regional. We're blessed to have a wonderfully huge nation, but there's also challenges with that because a message for the Southeast does not apply to the West Coast, Northeast, or vice versa in that. The other, one of the other, I think, initial decisions when thinking about a different component would be to evaluate your existing production systems and facilities. So, for example, if you do not have storage capacity to store raw components or raw goods or even mixed materials out of the weather, but yet they need to be, then that's a limitation in and of itself. So even storage or mixing facility, space, allocations. Also with the type of blending equipment that you have, if you're doing it yourself, all right, is this component going to be suitable for use in my existing systems? I think you also look at, well, what is your production system? And is the irrigation delivery from above or is it below? What size containers am I using? Because all growing media components, just based on their physical structures, don't fit in, fill up, or behave the same in these different container, gutter, bag systems. So I think you look holistically at what you've got, and then is there something available that checks most of the boxes as to an easy transition into, even before you start trialing it or looking at it. I think some of those questions, if there's positive answers provided, like, all right, yes, then that saves a lot of headache down the road, as opposed to trialing something, finding out it works, but then trying to scale it up on your operation and realizing, oh, I've got limitations I didn't quite think about.
Yeah, great. And then let's jump to the actual trial moment. So, you've worked through all of the sort of sourcing questions you just described, and now you've found something you're excited about because it does check a handful of those boxes. Where do you recommend people start? Is it 10% reduction in peat, 50% reduction in peat? How should they think about changing their watering style, their fertilizer style?
Right.
What are some of the things that go into it, and what do you see makes a successful trial versus one that's not?
I think one of the first things that comes to mind is, if it is possible to work with your growing media supplier, and if they have a lot of the growing media companies have technical support. If that is an option, then to work with someone who can guide them through the trial process. That's never a bad thing. So that's one option that may not be valid or viable for a lot of other people. The second thing that would almost be ideal too is if you could do depending on your setup, your system, your operation, if you could do a smaller block of a trial as opposed to, without interrupting the overall process of the operation, as opposed to having to do a big trial all at one time. So having a smaller trial is certainly advantageous in the long run. Now, while there are many ways of approaching trialing a new material, the approach that I have seen work best the most, and the one that I would employ, is whatever the new mix is, well, compare it directly to your old traditional mix and just manage it the same and learn from what you see the performance is or isn't. Now, that is easy if you're growing lettuce or growing annuals or growing quick rotational things. If you're wanting to do a trial with blueberries or some long-term perennial crop, that may not be as valid. So I just wanted to put that caveat there.
Yeah.
But with a direct comparison with what you're used to using versus what's new, if it fails, if the new mix fails, underperforms, then instead of saying, oh, it doesn't work, all right, let's back up. All right, then a second round, then how do I change my management to be unique and specific to this new mix to allow it to perform at its optimal highest level, thereby allowing the plant to perform at its optimal level, and me think differently than I did about how I've always watered, fertilized, handled my mix before. And I always use the analogy, and it's the best one that I've yet to that I can come up with. You know, if you are a parent, all right, and you got your first child, well, you may have read a couple of books or had someone around to tell you, but you got to figure out how to raise that first baby. And you do everything you can and do the best you can, and the child grows up, it's good and great. And then here comes baby number two. And what do? You treat baby number two the same way you treated baby number one, because that's what you knew to do, until you realize that your parenting, your nurturing approach was not being as effective for child two. So then you pivot to figure out how to best respond to their needs. And that is a very important topic, not as important as more important than growing media as far as raising children, but the concept is the same. Yeah. Always start by doing what you know, but then understand you got to back up and tweak it based on what it is and how it actually can perform. And there comes the water, the pH, the nutrition, and some of those things.
Great. I love the toddler substrate metaphor. And that's awesome. Well, that's exciting. I guess, you know, I mentioned I wanted to kind of hear the history and then where we're at today. And then I'm really curious to hear how you're thinking about the future. You know, if we're hopefully on this podcast 10 years from now, looking back, what are some of the differences you think we'll be seeing on the substrate side, on the hort side? And, you know, I guess what are some of the remaining outstanding questions that still need to be answered for us to get there?
Right. 11 years ago, there wasn't a wood fiber commercialized in the U.S. Mm-hmm. Today, there are 7 manufacturers just in the U.S. 10 years ago, there were 7 factories in the world making engineered wood fiber for growing media. Today, that number is over 120. And I give those just numbers and company facilities perspectives to show the emphasis that has been identified and placed on forest and wood products as being such an integral part of the future to solve as one piece of the puzzle to solve the issues of growing media volumes and availability.
Yep.
So I think in the U.S., growers have become more accustomed to and open to ideas about different growing media additives and components than they were 5 or 10, 20 years ago. That has nothing to do about how smart or intelligent they are. It's just over time, when more information is provided, then more confidence and familiarity begins to build. And I think that certainly happened within the grower sector today, either small or large. And I think that openness to evolve based on economics, availability, supply chain stability, whatever it may be for the individual grower, I think that's allowing growers to be a lot more flexible and a lot more amenable to change and to consider new things and options that they didn't in the past. So I think that will continue to change. What's going to, I think, also pop up on the radar, depending on where one is regionally, are the types of materials that are being offered, either in raw material bulk for growers to buy and blend their own, or the composition of pre-mixed products from suppliers. Because there's even the peat companies in Canada and all the way through the United States, there's so much emphasis on what raw materials can we now use, even in smaller percents, again, as small pieces of the puzzle to help address the volume, demand, and supply issues that we have moving forward. I think you're also going to see the likelihood of some really new materials pop up onto the radar, other than wood, other than sugarcane bagasse, other than barks and things, because there are a lot of other industries with very different technologies that are suffering their own downturn for whatever reason, and they are looking at other industries for possible avenues of new market. And I think we already are a little bit. I think we're going to see more really new, maybe even some synthetic materials that may enter to the workflow to try to address some very specific problems in certain places. So, and then the last thing I would say, as far as like looking ahead a little bit, I think one of the, and I've jokingly said before, I think someone would win a Nobel Prize for this, but instead of just evaluating new raw materials, either solely or in conjunction with something else to formulate a growing media to grow whatever crop, a technology, whether that's a device, whether it's a chemical application, whether it's a process, pre-treatment or something, but some way in which organic materials, which the volumes of biomass available are infinite almost, could be stabilized in a way that would better allow them to remain stable, meaning functionally stable, physically stable, chemically stable, longer. And by longer, I mean long enough for a crop to be grown in it, and then it can collapse and disappear if it wants to. So I think some stabilization mechanism of organic materials will really open up a lot more opportunities. But, the other part of that too, Chad, and this is something, you're well versed in, but as we look at other technologies, even in char or carbonization of various organic materials and the benefits that can be associated with that holistically, but what does that mean about the end products of those processes? How can they be better utilized to plug in as another piece of the puzzle in a way that addresses challenges and problems that other currently worked on or currently adopted materials can't? And that's how I kind of look at new materials, is each thing has its own set of advantages or novelty functions. And it's all about putting these different things together that hopefully solve the more holistic picture of a end product that performs well under these circumstances, is as regionally or locally or sustainably, consciously produced as possible. And I think that's more and more going to be entwined into the future of any mix or any growing operation.
Yeah, I mean, I'm biased, but I couldn't agree more. And we get super excited about this idea of, yes, there's a near infinite amount of biomaterial available out there. We as humans have gotten really good at pulling crop residues and processing it, and there's a ton of leftovers when you do that. And how can we turn some of that, what's now seen as a waste, both in terms of economic perspective, but also in terms of, CO2 and methane coming off of that waste.
Yeah, because waste is a human-derived concept. Waste does not exist. Earth does not know waste. We only attribute waste because we don't see its immediate use to our advantage, benefit, or economics. So you're exactly right.
Definitely. And so can we take that perceived waste and create value for growers, but also, offset some of the challenges that they're having on the substrate side. So, I think there's tons of opportunity in the biochar and the char world to start to try to solve some of these problems. But to your point, you outlined it super well. Like, there's still a lot of hurdles with figuring out the change management, running through the trials, getting the economics in a place that actually work when you compare it to peat or cocoa or, some of the other things growers are using.
And, and again, this is more your wheelhouse than mine and many others for that matter. But oftentimes when a new process product is being introduced, even if there's years of background in R&D, but thinking in the manufacturing of biochar, for example, which can be more of a verb than a noun, just based on how it's made and all of the other variables that make it a product line, not a product. Well, the scalability of that is often expensive. And I think back to growing up in the 90s when the on-the-shoulder camcorder came out, and these things were massive, and walk around family reunions and church playgrounds, and that's all you see with these big camcorders. And they cost like $1,000 in 1990, which is massive, a crazy amount of money. And then they got so cheap, and then they eventually got outplaced by other technologies. But even if you look at some of the char factories and industries and products, the price scale it starts high, and then with the efficiency and working better towards how to improve the system and how to scale it and inputs, then the cost begins to come down, and then the opportunities for, I think, new marketplace really expand rapidly.
Definitely. And we've even seen it, in the last couple of years. I mean, when I first started buying biochar in 2020, it was $1,000 a ton. That was kind of the going rate for char. And at those rates, it's just not economically viable for most things.
That also brings up one point. Let me circle back, if I may. You asked this, and I failed to answer it, but with a grower considering, trialing a new mix or substituting something for something else, kind of where do you start or what you want to look at? One of the common threads that I think was pretty consistent across the U.S., even dating back 10 years ago, when growers began trialing wood mixes or wood products in their existing mixes, they went after the most expensive component first. And most always that's perlite, at least in all of our traditional mixes. So to go after perlite and say, all right, can I substitute that? Because there is an immediate cost savings, potentially, and usually always is, and it's a smaller fraction, therefore there's less likelihood of it drastically changing the whole system. So I think that's one of the quick approaches, certainly not to be against the perlite folks, but that's the lowest hanging fruit of what can be supplemented or switched out with the less likely consequence.
Yeah, great. Yeah, I completely agree. And again, when biochar was $1,000 a ton, there were only so many places where that was economically viable. But as the price has fallen, I mean, we're seeing a third of that cost, if not lower, today, depending on where you are in the country and what it's made from. You start to unlock different pieces of the substrate and start to hopefully deliver value for people. Again, especially if you start to weigh in the holistic cost of this media and how you're thinking about your input costs and water costs and labor and loss. And so
the initial cost of any mix or any component is only one part of the equation that anyone needs to consider relative to the overall financial positive or negative of making a switch from what they used to use versus new. It's only the first data point.
Yeah, totally. So anyway, there's lots more work to be done, but we're super excited about the future and grateful for all the work that you've done as well. We stand on the shoulder of giants here.
Well, it's a fun place. It's a fun area to work in, because it's not just being able to apply science and then see the results and helping to advance some technologies, but when you see data and results immediately adopted by growers, big and small, and they're making business decisions on these data, then that gets real. And it gets real quick as to the validity, the timeliness, and the overall nature of what you're doing and what you're being a part of. And that's an immediate economic decision, but it's also a more holistic, I think more about developing countries and other parts of the world and how soilless technologies can help advance their lives and put food on their table when they need it most. Whereas oftentimes in Europe and in North America and other places, we're just trying to save a little bit more money or be a little bit more efficient. And that's all good, but there's technologies in what we're doing in the soilless side of things that can literally help peoples of the world, and that excites me immensely.
For sure. And hopefully, as we keep pushing the edge here in the States, a lot of the developing countries can just leapfrog some of these advancements and skip the 60 years of R&D that we've had to do to figure out how to get here.
Exactly. I think that's the goal for any ideal world system, is to help each other build off what others have done so they don't have to repeat the same thing, just adapt it or adopt it for their region or their area.
Yeah, 100%. Well, this was awesome. This was so fun. I know you're in your insane busy time, so I don't want to take up too much more of your time. But I'm super grateful for your time and knowledge. And I guess before we wrap, any other parting thoughts, anything else you want to share for folks listening and thinking about this problem set that you didn't think we covered?
Any of the topics we covered could be, a day's discussion, as
For
you
sure.
know, and I'm sure any of the listeners know. I think I would just offer the reminder, because everyone already knows this, about how to source accurate, updated information to base your decisions on, business decisions on. And if you don't know, ask someone for that, because a Google search or Chat GPT will not give you unbiased, clear, factual answers. And I know that from my own personal experience. So go to find the right resources to stay updated, and then make decisions for yourself based on your conditions, your needs, your future, and not just what someone else is doing or because it seems popular.
Yeah, great. And if folks wanted to follow along the work that you're doing, or support or potentially participate, where do you recommend they go next? Where would you like to point them?
I do have a website, which is super easy, Brian Jackson, NC State University. You'll find it, that or through LinkedIn are the two easiest platforms to kind of stay abreast of what's happening, what's going on, or just to contact in general.
Great. All right. Well, Brian, thanks so much for your time. I hope you have an awesome day.
You're welcome, Chad. Thanks for the opportunity. Always great to chat about a topic that's not only timely but exciting to me.
Yeah.
And I appreciate your partnership and collaboration over the years, and happy to continue that.
Same here. This was super fun.